As information technology is accelerating the internationalization process worldwide, Japan has emerged as one of the important markets for global enterprises. In spite of this fact, however, Japanese culture, society, and its people are still a bit of a mystery for business persons of other countries. This, from time to time, creates difficulties and even conflicts in proceeding smoothly in business with Japanese. This program intends to provide references to assist people in their intercultural communications with Japanese business persons. First, we would like to explain why intercultural communication is sometimes difficult. As you know, there exist different cultures, societies, educational systems, and lifestyles in different nations. Thus, one's thinking process and level of knowledge varies from person to person. No matter the culture or background, complications arising from communication problems among parties having different nationalities exist. However, as human beings, many people in every country share a common ground of understanding, meaning that their differences are very small and even at times superficial. This suggests that all persons, when having intercultural communications, could reach a real understanding with their counterparts, while acknowledging and considering the difficulties of communication. Let us define the steps of understanding. First, understanding starts from a fact. This is the first layer. Next, a person interprets the fact. This is the second layer. And finally, he makes his judgment based on the interpretation, the third and final layer. Then he or she speaks or communicates with others based on the judgment. This implies that the counterpart receives information once processed by the communicator's judgment and interpretation. It means that one, when needed, should go beyond the communicator's judgment layer and enter into the next or additional layer to successfully accomplish real communication. Let's see what happens to those who live in the same country. For people who live in the same country or have the same background of culture, both senders and receivers of information share similarities in interpretation and judgment, thus providing common ground for communication. However, in intercultural communication, both the interpreting and judging mechanisms vary among different parties, thus requiring more work from the parties concerned for better understanding. When talking about Japan, communication with Japanese is as challenging as with those of other countries. One of the reasons is the nature of language, for Japanese communication tends to be more indirect and contain more nonverbal messages than in many other cultures. Japan's unique culture, fostered within its islands over 1,000 years, further complicates matters. In this video, we will show you what you should consider when doing business with Japanese and their companies. First, we would like to point out differences in business scope between companies in Japan and in other countries. As you know, when evaluating companies on the stock market, we use various indexes, which are common worldwide. However, the terms for rating them differs in each country, which reflects the management styles of many companies. As you know, in the case of the United States, for example, the market usually highlights quarterly operational results of a company. Shareholders do this as well. Consequently, top management focuses on relatively short-term operational periods of 3 months. Operating officers, including chief executives, are often replaced according to these operational results. So what happens in the Japanese market from this point of view? The situation is slightly different. Although the companies listed on the market declare half-year operational results, their shareholders are more concerned about an entire year's results. This allows top management to recover possible losses incurred during the rest of the fiscal year. Japanese directors, having duties and responsibilities in routine business operations, usually stay in their positions for a certain period of time and are not often fired in the middle of a term. Influenced by this, one-time remuneration is relatively low compared to that in many other countries. Dividends are another example. Most Japanese companies have a management policy of retaining earnings to the maximum extent possible for the purpose of reinforcing their business base and capabilities. Therefore, they pay relatively small dividends to their shareholders, who have followed this policy and do not usually request an increase in dividend payments. Employment indicates another aspect of conservative policy. Although changing, a Japanese business person usually works up to a senior position in one company. In return, many companies continue traditional lifetime employment for their employees, recognizing that the system involves both advantages and disadvantages. All these factors combined allow Japanese management to have a longer-term business scope than those in some other countries. This scope of business affects routine businesses from various aspects. Let's look at some examples where foreign business persons often become somewhat bewildered. One common point is that Japanese business persons tend to consume time talking about non-business topics before entering into business talk. In addition, they frequently conduct business outside of the office. This includes golf and dinner parties, among others. In many cases, these activities exclude spouses and other family members. Foreign business persons often wonder why Japanese spend such a long time for non-business matters. The fact is that Japanese, through these processes, foster firm relations. Trust comes first, and next comes business. Their intention is not to waste precious time, but to establish a firm platform for starting business. A second example of this is the importance of a third party's introduction for the first appointment with a Japanese business person. Another example involves keiretsu, meaning business alliance groups in Japan. Rather than excluding outsiders, it is a shortcut to building relations. This does not necessarily mean that the introduction or keiretsu is essential for the first contact, but without them, naturally, a certain amount of time will be required for research before initiating business. Once business begins and trust is established, contracts are often not needed. Although many Japanese companies engage in international business, they in many cases process domestic transactions without written contracts based solely on verbal commitments. Thus, the number of legal affairs in Japan is quite low compared to that in many other countries. Japanese companies, in case problems occur, tend to sit down at the negotiation table and pursue possibilities for settling differences in a friendly manner. This sense derives from the preference for a long-term relationship and a trust first and business next point of view. Thus, giving time and making financial investments before business begins leads to strong long-term relations. Now, we would like to point out the recommendations from what we have learned in this discussion for better communication. One is that even when perceiving peculiarities while negotiating with Japanese, one should reconsider and understand that they follow their own way of reaching a conclusion by means of discussing issues. It is not recommended that you pursue a business closing at an early stage, even though you may think it is feasible or convenient from your point of view. Excessive requests for a conclusion could jeopardize your position, creating a pushy and aggressive image for your organization. Another recommendation could be that if you have a definite deadline for closing business, you should clearly state that deadline either in formal or informal settings. Although you may think that this weakens your negotiating position by revealing information, it shows your counterparts that you are open and honest. Since Japanese do not intend to waste time or lose business opportunities, if definitely needed, they will certainly try to reach a conclusion within a reasonable scope of time. Just as good intercultural communication is based on the understanding of both parties, you can frankly speak to Japanese businesspersons. Next is a difference in decision-making processes among companies. A long-term business scope was elaborated on in the previous section. This scope often leads to a relatively slow pace in making decisions. Japanese people prefer taking time to consider business from various points of view. They naturally hate to waste time. However, an early decision without thorough consideration will be even worse for them. To thoroughly consider an issue, they have a group decision-making process called the Ringi system. In this Ringi system, an inter-office proposal is usually prepared by lower-level staff and passed to their seniors. Other related divisions, such as risk assessment, legal affairs, finance, manufacturing, and research and development divisions, and finally to top management when necessary. During the process, all staff concerned make comments on the proposal, modify, change, or refuse in necessary cases until agreement is finally reached. As you can see, a group consensus from top management to the bottom is created through this Ringi system. The traditional Japanese way of doing business is to train themselves in the companies they belong to and complete their business through group effort. Although changing, employees generally select a company, not a job or position in the company. After entering a firm, the company selects an appropriate position for the employee. Every few years, the employee is rotated. Thus, a sense of loyalty is created, and job hopping, although increasing, remains rare. Thus, a bottom-up management base is established in many Japanese companies. Long or lifetime employment commonly applied to various companies also contributes to this group working system. Considering long-time collaboration with business colleagues, Japanese prefer to avoid conflicts and complete their specifically assigned roles within a group. For managers, this is beneficial because they can conduct trainings for lower-level staff using a bottom-up management system, thus reinforcing a continuous firm base for the company. Now, let's look at how this decision-making system affects routine business operations in Japan. First, you may encounter Japanese business persons spending too much time for consideration of a project compared to the amount of time you may think is reasonable. They may say, "The project is under review," or "I have passed the proposal to my superiors." In such a case, the project would be under the Ringi system. The person who you contact may not be in a position to answer your questions, for he or she has no authorization. Repeated queries will not improve the situation. In such a case, one possible option could be that you pursue an opportunity to contact a senior staff member or top manager of the counterpart and ask them directly. Naturally, You should be cautious in not giving offense to the lower-level staff, who will be your direct partner in the business. But this is an option. Let's look at another example. You may have business meetings in which no decision makers or senior staff attend. If you feel uncomfortable, remember the group working concept. Once they have reached a conclusion, all of their members will share the same thoughts about the business at hand. It means that the person, even if he or she is junior, will provide you with the company's policy as their representative. The difference between lower and upper level representatives is the extent to which you can negotiate with them. Naturally, lower level staff have a limited capability. In another example, you may find opportunities where different staff appear and ask you the same questions that you were asked by other staff members. Again, you may feel uncomfortable if you see this as a waste of time. It may be possible that the Ringi system is not working properly. In this case, you should be patient and refer to the previous meetings with their staff, or make another presentation to them if required. Not all Ringi systems work well. Understanding Japanese group concepts in business will help you to pursue favorable results for your company. Now, let's point out the recommendations for this discussion. When negotiating with Japanese, you should clearly understand the Japanese decision-making process, which definitely takes time. But once decided, all members involved take similar actions and implement quickly. When the proposal is in the Ringi system, you will not get answers even if you push lower-level staff. Be patient and wise to pursue favorable results. In necessary cases, you may wish to consider another approach to their superiors or top management, using a third party's introduction or other ways, and negotiate with them directly. Next is a discussion about differences in ways of communication. In the first discussion, we learned about 3 steps for understanding others. In the interpretation step, a person sends or receives information from outside, meaning that the communicator sends or receives information from various mediums. He or she may speak, write, or show you visually. He or she has choices how to send information directly to the counterpart. In addition to this, communication may be processed indirectly through assumptions made by the sender and receiver. If we define communication styles, a chart would look like this. Verbal information will be on one side and nonverbal, that is, an assumption, on the other side. We could say that all communication consists of verbal and nonverbal assumptions. These two are distributed depending on each person, the nature of language, nationality, and other cultural factors. From this point of view, Japanese nonverbal language is based more on the side of unstated assumptions. Although this depends on each communicator, Japanese business persons tend to have discussions based on assumed understandings. Japanese call it inspiration and expiration. Vagueness in Japanese language even spurs nonverbal communication. Consequently, asking the receiver to guess and perceive the sender's intention is often a style Japanese use. For example, Japanese sentences do not always require subjects such as I or we. Depending on the situation, the receiver assumes and understands by him or herself. In addition, Japanese are more concerned about losing face for their counterparts and themselves. Therefore, they tend to leave the points in dispute untouched and try not to reach an immediate agreement, thus avoiding possible direct confrontation. Such communication differences cause possible misunderstandings in intercultural business. You may encounter Japanese not saying yes or no clearly. They frequently say, "We will study it." In both cases, although they may be on the negative side at the moment, the fact is that they prefer to not deny something outright. In other words, they'd like to ask that you assume and understand their stance without verbal communication. If you require their definite conclusion, it is recommended that you leave that subject to their consideration and set a deadline for their final reply. That way, you could get a clear verbal answer from them. Let's look at another case. When you make a presentation to Japanese, you may encounter silence for a while. One possibility is that they have not clearly understood, or they think they may have misunderstood your presentation. As Japanese are accustomed to assuming and interpreting what others are feeling and hate losing face, they, in many cases, prefer postponing their questions to another time. Their linguistic ability is also a handicap in making questions instantly. You may encounter Japanese suddenly talking in Japanese between them. This may encourage you to be nervous in hearing their next conversation, but they in many cases do not intend to imply offense to you. The conversation could be understood as a way of reconfirming their mutual understanding verbally, or they may try to reach a consensus on a subject among them. Do not take offense. They are just preparing for the next communication. Now, to recap recommendations of this discussion. Communication consists of verbal and nonverbal information, as well as assumptions. Japanese business persons communicate with others based largely on nonverbal assumptions. In consideration of this, it is not always recommended that you pursue an instant reply of yes or no if your Japanese partners hesitate to answer questions. If you cannot understand what your Japanese counterpart says, asking him or her from a different angle could work. For example, in a plain word, "Do you mean such and such?" Instead of asking for a final conclusion, you may get better results by attempting to clarify where discussion points are unclear. Finally, allow for a certain period of time for consideration and set a deadline for their reply. In this section, we will talk about language barriers. Having fostered a monoculture within its isolated land, Japanese people used to have no need to learn other languages. And today, although many Japanese business persons speak English, not all of them are good at English. They, in many cases, face difficulties in understanding nuances of expression when foreigners speak at a normal speed. One of the major reasons for this is the structure of language, which is totally different between Japanese and other languages, particularly English. A typical contrast is the position of a verb in a sentence. Let's take a look at this example. One person says, "The ship will arrive tomorrow." In Japanese, we say, "Ashita fune ga tsukimasu." The verb is located in the first part in English and in the last part in Japanese. If we change this to a negative sentence, the expression would look like this. The ship will not arrive tomorrow. In Japanese, "Ashita fune wa tsukimasen." This simple sentence shows that Japanese language forces the listener to wait until the final word appears in order to understand the real meaning of the sentence. In addition, various imported words and phrases are used, and often mistakenly applied in everyday conversation among Japanese people. When using imported expressions, they have their own definition for each word or phrase, which is not applicable to real English. Under such circumstances, they often face difficulties in distinguishing proper and improper English expressions. All of these facts cause problems. For example, Japanese say many times yes as a direct translation of the word in Japanese, hai, which does not necessarily mean agreement. It means, I have heard your explanation, or I have received your information. Since Japanese are accustomed to saying hai in their conversation, they erroneously use yes when communicating in English as well. Therefore, they continue to like to use yes, but I think such and such, which confuses many foreign people. Thus, taking into account that they do not necessarily mean agreement when saying yes is advised. Another example is that Japanese, having mastered English grammar, often make sentences which are good from a grammatical point of view, but are not used in daily communication. They even use Japanese English, which is often not understandable. In these cases, ask for the real meaning using different words or phrases, because they may not be aware of the fact that they speak English incorrectly. You may encounter Japanese who abruptly stop speaking English. In this case, their linguistic ability is probably questionable. In many cases, Japanese are not good at listening to English, even if one speaks fluently. Therefore, you are recommended to slow down the pace, or even reiterate and rephrase major points to confirm communication. Now, the recommendations from this section. First, you should understand that many Japanese speak English, but not all of them are good at it. Listening, in particular, is hard work for many of them. They misunderstand and sometimes speak Japanese English. Therefore, native speakers having English as their mother tongue should speak slowly and clearly. It is also recommended that you confirm important points step by step to avoid any misunderstandings. And as for the expressions of Japanese people, if you do not understand them, ask for the real meaning using other words or phrases. Communication is difficult even among people from the same country. Thus, intercultural communication will necessarily be more difficult. However, through understanding your counterparts, you can establish a base for better communication.